Thank you all. This is just such a great conference, and it's a little bit easier to be up here because now I know a lot of you and bonded on the bus back from the horseback ride over a beer and a seltzer, so that's all good. So as Steve said, Sensis plays in the multicultural space, not just in Hispanic, but also African American and Asian. But today I'm going to focus on the Hispanic market. And just proud to be part of the largest minority-owned multicultural agency in the country, which is quite an accomplishment that our president has achieved. So thank you for listening. I'm going to start first talking a little bit about the Hispanic market, and just kind of a quick primer for those of you who maybe don't work in it, and just kind of how it's changed and what's going on as far as trends. We're kind of categorizing markets in the Hispanic world into two sort of buckets. One, we're calling them the fusion mega markets. And so think an LA, a Miami, a Houston, where you have a very large Hispanic population, and then you have lots of other cultures going on as well. But the Hispanic populations in these mega markets are really being driven by US-born millennials. So that makes them really different because typically when you're US born, you tend to not be a Spanish preferred person. You tend to kind of be living in two worlds, if you will. But then on the other side of the house are these emerging markets. And I think a lot of us who do Hispanic day in and day out sort of thought that maybe these emerging markets were going to end because migration had really slowed down. But that trend is now, of course, changing over the last about 7 years. There's just been a lot of migration into the United States, and it's hitting some interesting markets like the Atlantas and the Charlottes and the Oklahoma cities, some places that we maybe had a little bit of Hispanic, but now we have a lot more going on. But these markets are definitely minority Hispanic markets. They're not majority. And so they kind of take a different approach because that population is going to be a Spanish preferred population. They're going to not be really living in both worlds. They're still kind of new, if you will. So they take a different approach, which we're calling more multicultural. So think silos versus the mega markets that require more of that crossing over. When we think about the Hispanic population, it's now over 60 million individuals in the United States, representing a very wide countries of origin mix. And the US Census changed a lot of the coding, and you can now select more than one ethnicity. And by doing that, we're seeing that the Hispanic population is quite diverse in its ethnicity and not just Hispanic. So for instance, we have a very large group of people now saying they're Afro-Caribbean, which makes a lot of sense. And that's a new thing in the census. So there's lots of ways to slice and dice the data for sure. We're spread geographically. I'm going to show you a couple of maps. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of changes in migration. One thing that's really, really key is the fact that we are young. We are the youngest population segment in the United States with over 31% under 18. That means we're going to be driving a ton of categories in the future as well as now. We have recent arrivals from countries like Venezuela and Colombia that have much higher education rates than the US population. Millennials, because we talked about how a lot of millennials are US born, they really are starting to drive higher incomes. And then just in the past decade in general among Hispanics, we've seen a doubling of bachelor's degrees. When we think ahead, we're about 12% of the US buying power, but that has been an 87% increase just in the past decade alone. We have larger households, so we spend more. We spend more on things like groceries. And we also have a very high small business startup rate at 44% versus 4% non-Hispanic. These categories that are really going to be important, and I hope a lot of you all can take this away today, are things like cars, electronics, retail sporting goods, housing, anything baby, and others. So this is really something to focus on if you're not already. I get asked this question a lot, is Spanish dead? And I think a lot of us that have been in this industry for a long time, we really saw a waning in the use of Spanish or the primary Spanish speakers, and that was because of the waves of immigration, and eventually people either learn English or their children learn English, and so we sort of see that wane. But now with increases in immigration again and where people are coming from, we're seeing a change. So in the year 2000, we had about 28 million Hispanics say that they spoke Spanish at home, and they were predominantly along coastal U.S. cities, both on the East Coast, the Gulf Coast, and the West Coast. But fast forward to 2022, and now we're 42.3 million. So out of that 63 million, 42 million speak Spanish in the household. That's a 49% increase. So Spanish is here to stay, at least for another generation. So that's an important takeaway, even though we know all Hispanics don't speak Spanish or may not prefer Spanish. Depending on the market, back to those markets that we looked at earlier, it's important to keep that in mind. So how many people have heard of Chef Merito, other than in the agenda for today? Okay, so old brand, they were started in California. They have a pretty strong footprint in California, and they basically make seasoning blends and other food products. Very wide line, everything from breadcrumbs to marinades to seasoning blends, and then even the little consomme cubes. They really had done a great job of building their distribution at the Hispanic grocery store level by the relationships with butchers. So if you think about it, you go and you buy like chicken that's already got seasoning on it, or beef and fajitas or whatever, and so it was the butcher that was really helping to drive usage. Fast forward to today, wanting a stronger growth model, they are in the Vons and the Krogers, but their bread and butter is still those Latino stores. But what they do know is that among their users, they're not deep users. So they might have one or two favorite products, but they're not necessarily using the whole line. So there's a lot of work to be done. So the challenge that they came to us is what are the segments we should be looking at in order to grow? And how can we really build more reach, more engagement, and drive purchases? The 2 to 2.5 million, that was the year 2 budget. I'm gonna take you through year 1 and year 2. But really, the challenge is should we focus on the grilling of meats, or should we focus on special occasions like Lent, Christmas, etc., or some of these raging products like birria. Has anybody had a birria taco? Yeah, they're pretty hot right now. So the strategy was first looking at a deep dive of who these cooks are. And sorry for the eye chart on this one, but basically what this is telling us is that there still is a reliance on Spanish. That is by far the largest segment when you add people who are bilingual and Spanish preferred. It's also telling us that there's not very much impulse buy among this strong, heavy seasoning user, and that there is quite a bit of brand loyalty. So we did a deeper dive. We like to do proprietary research, and then we like to overlay MRI Simmons, and it kind of helps us get to some of these sweet spots, especially when you're looking at expanding your target. And what we found was that there was a bicultural cook that was willing to try, and especially if she found a recipe on social media, and then that one ingredient, she doesn't have it, and so she has to go out and buy it. And so that's kind of where the focus of this case study is gonna lie. So this primary consumer that they had been talking to was 35 to 44, so slightly older, definitely in these California markets where they had great distribution. Heavy seasoning user, was already aware of Chef Merito, cooks a lot at home, as I mentioned, relies on Spanish, and shopping at these Hispanic grocery stores. But the challenge was that this segment was really sticking to brands that they knew, and a lot of that is that you've already built up habits, right? It's sort of like when you know how to make something and it's your killer chili, you're not gonna go try this other thing because you make killer chili already, right? So it's the same thing with this lady. She's less willing to kind of try new things. But the bicultural one we talked about those Hispanic mega markets, is think sriracha hot sauce. Like, that is something that crossed over to so many groups of people. Well, the same thing is sort of like this bicultural lady, because she's living in both worlds. And so she's getting exposed to, a lot of fusion type foods. So she's the one that's like willing to do some things on the spur of the moment, but she's also more likely to be working. So she has to find shortcuts and ways to still be authentic, but also cook some pretty good food. And I think, being driven by coupons is also a really great thing, especially when you have these micro stores that you know where they are and you know that your shopper's there. So as she's living in, this broad world, I mean, she's got like all these things in her tool chest, but she's also willing to find these shortcuts. And so I think a lot of us that are working moms, we're very used to this, or working dads, we're used to the fact that a lot of these things are going to save you time, especially something like birria, where you have to go and boil, your guajillo chilies, and then you have to like take all the seeds out, and then you have to, pick your oregano off the stalk. There's all these steps to it. And so if you can just go and you can buy this thing that's going to make delicious food, well, you kind of get it. So as this bicultural lady is living in these two worlds, I mean, you can see kind of the anomalies that are happening, the fact that she's using like maybe an air fryer, or just kind of all over the place in what's in her repertoire, much more expansive than the less acculturated. So how do we reach them? Sensis uses a CPG, disrupted habitual journey model, and in order to sort of test this Chef Merito new campaign, we wanted just to focus on those Hispanic grocers as the known quantity. And the strategy in year one was we knew we couldn't turn our back on the less acculturated. We knew that she had the highest awareness. We knew that she was the highest spice user, and made up 54% of the current customer base. So that was like a given that we couldn't walk away. But she has really different media habits from somebody who's more bicultural. So we had to kind of keep in the Spanish TV, the radio, the outdoor. We did activations to try to build trial, and obviously social. But then we wanted to test and learn among the more bicultural consumer. And we knew that she, like I said, was more open to try new things, and that she was also actually open to Chef Merito and knew the brand. And that was really our openness to grow there. So her products she was driven by recipes, she was driven by seasonings and marinades, and her moments were things like summer grilling, and definitely influencers, being in social. So she was more of a digital influencer social target. So this is year one. And so kind of this is like almost like a soap opera approach where you have the mother, and she's like so cool, and she knows how to make all these great foods, and they're authentic, and then the daughter kind of wants to emulate her. And so this says the secret's in the flavor, and the whole campaign was about authentic Latin flavor. So we repositioned Chef Merito as like this key ingredient for you to make authentic Latino flavor. So I'm gonna play y'all the video, and hopefully it'll play. Whoops, I messed up, hang on. I went too fast. It doesn't like to go back. Let me go back one more, and let me go forward. Okay, don't touch it, Karla.
Ahora que ya tienes tu familia, mijita, es momento que te comparta mi secreto. Chef Merito es mi secreto. Es lo que hace deliciosa la comida y le da esos sabores que le traen recuerdos de su hogar a tu padre.
Ahora el sabor más auténtico puede ser tuyo.
Okay. So you see like that the mom's letting the daughter in on the secret. The daughter's the one that's going to take the shortcuts. The mom isn't going to take the shortcuts, and so that was sort of the setup there. From a digital perspective on some of the ads that we ran in social as well, all of the ads that were very mom-focused or that unacculturated focus, they just talked about reinforcing the fact that this has been a flavor for generations. But we also kind of started priming this unacculturated lady to think about all the thousands of things that she could make delicious if she used Chef Merito. So that's that longer one. But then on the social side, and particularly the English versions, we kind of did this top secret thing that, you know, we're letting you in on this secret, and this is how you can make this amazing food that's Latin. So it really is about these blends. So back to the birria example, the fact that, you know, you can sit there for hours and you can get all this stuff ready, or you can just go buy the Chef Merito birria seasoning. So I know what I'm going to do. And then how we reach them. So year one, we definitely could not turn away from that less acculturated individual. But we mixed in some digital to drive awareness and engagement, and that was really a lot of the testing that was done. You can see that about 70% of the target is less acculturated, and 60% was that bicultural, bilingual. And then the media mix was pretty deep. We couldn't turn our back, as I mentioned earlier, on some traditional media, in addition to the digital tests that we were doing. In year two, we were able to, based on our learnings, we were able to focus much more on those biculturals, and that included utilizing a variety of specialty partners. And actually, one of your sponsors in market was one of our partners that's very strong with the shopper approach. So thank you for being our partner on that. But we also use a lot of other publishers like H Code that brings us a ton of Hispanic content. So that was part of the equation too. And then importantly, we brought in some Latino actors and some influencers who really helped drive some purchase behaviors around those special occasions. And you see the media mix now included much more digital focus, and that was a deliberate to do the AAU study. We had traditional and digital as that test and learn, and then in year two, we saw that the digital was really working, so we just went to that. So on the results, looking at the campaign effectiveness, we really focused on those first 5 steps of the customer journey. And we prepared this whole analysis for Chef Merito, focusing on the trigger, the pre-purchase, and the purchase stages. And we conducted the second ad tracker. And we saw that unaided awareness went from 2% to 8%. Somebody was talking earlier about the importance of that unaided awareness, right? Because you're building that propensity to build trial. And then aided awareness went from 47 to 58. But a key learning here with the Hispanic market is that there's a lot of halo effect between those who only speak Spanish and those who are bilingual to always include a certain amount of traditional media, because it is a segment that is consuming still traditional media, even though that younger, more bicultural individual is obviously, you know, spending a lot of time on digital and a lot of time, you know, on the internet and all those other places, but we saw that it definitely impacted the campaign. So in terms of pre-purchase, purchase, and experience, we saw click-through rates at over 10% to the Chef Merito digital properties. We had monthly sales increase 25% year over year, and our marinades really took off 43% year over year. And then the launch that was 2020 to 2021 led to a real increase in just general sales, and I'm going to show you a chart for that. And of course, I know you guys are all going, well, I did a lot more cooking because it was COVID, right? And so we know that that was part of it, but it did really help expand the awareness of Chef Merito and the usage of it. And we think that that's going to be a long-term trend for this brand. And then we were able to really grow the follower base, especially using those influencers, so that people wanted to find our recipes and wanted to know what we had in the mix. So these are all with the asterisks, those are all the products that we promoted, but you can see that there was lift in other products, just as general as people became aware of the entire line. And that's it. Thank you.
Karla, thank you. Time for any questions for Karla?
I think over there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I swear I don't love asking questions. It's just, this was super interesting. You pretty much nailed my family. The less articulated would be my mother-in-law, and then the bicultural is my wife and my daughter. So I can see how you're able to develop your targets, but the challenge that I've seen, you know, finding the less articulated, I see a lot of media spend on the usual Univision, Telemundos. But when it comes to identifying the signals for the bicultural, I know that my wife, my daughter, and myself in our household, we're putting out signals where you wouldn't know that we're Hispanic by the content that we're consuming, unless maybe you're looking at maybe our Pandora stations. That would probably be the only real way, but we're consuming things that you would not know that we are Hispanic just by the content that we're consuming. Even though we do, you know, speak a lot of Spanish in the house, and culturally, everything that we're doing is aligning with Hispanic. So while you're able to identify your targets, how are you able to identify the bicultural online? What signals are you actually looking for to be able to identify those users?
So, I mean, that's a huge one. That's why your partners are so important, because by using in-market and we used GumGum, and there were a variety of partners, we were able to look at geography and really hone in. And remember, we focused on those Hispanic stores, so we know that if you're shopping at a Hispanic store, you're probably more likely to be Hispanic. And so even if you are more acculturated, many people, as you're saying, I'm sure maybe out of all the meals y'all make in a week, you know, you still have a percent that is a meal that's maybe Latin focused. And so that was sort of part of this, was how geographically to focus on areas that were Hispanic areas where we know they're Hispanic. And it is a hard thing, because, I mean, I'm like that too. I mean, my family, my husband's very Anglo, but then, you know, I have taco night and all that good stuff. So it's a harder thing. And I think on platforms like audio streaming, obviously it's a lot easier on audio streaming because people are choosing certain artists. But, you know, a lot of people who are more bicultural are still maybe focused on a habit like watching the evening news in Spanish, or perhaps watching soccer, or a certain show might be your favorite show. So we know that there's a lot of great data on people hopping around, and we're able to put those dots together.
But it does seem to me that it raises the question of how accurate the data is, especially from your third-party providers, because you've got an even higher bar to reach, or a much more complicated ask than even what Freddie was talking about with his data provider. So I'm curious if you've found that in shopping around and looking for vendors to work with or data providers to work with, is there a wide variation in how well and how accurately they're actually measuring this audience, especially that bicultural audience?
So H-Code was one of the major partners on the Hispanic content side, and they actually have a pretty big repertoire that's not just all Spanish focused. And so that, and I think also influencers, I think the fact that, you know, if you're following, say, a Latina supermodel, or irregardless of language, there's interest there. Now we have our own DSP, and so things are going to be kind of different moving forward for Chef Merito. But at this time, those were the partners that we had, and they were very strong at putting together the shopper piece, and the shopper piece at these Hispanic markets. So that was really what was key about this campaign and its success.
And would you say that for this market, the social influencers are of even heightened importance? Because that's really one of the best ways to gauge. They've got a better network than you'll ever have.
Yeah, I mean, that's been
identifying those people who may be giving off a lot of cross signals within the digital world. The influencers really are connecting with them much more directly and can identify that community maybe better than any data provider could.
Right. So that was a big component of this, as was the activation as well. Like, it's just something that we do very well, is being at the store and understanding who's at the store to build the trial. But I think definitely when you saw that this was someone that was more inclined to try new recipes, think all of that, the social piece really tied in, and that, and then the occasions, the seasonality of when are you going to be willing to maybe make something that you don't make during the week because you're working and you're busy. So those all helped build trial.
Now, you said that in your second year you were able to focus a little bit more on the biculturals. Does that mean that the effort to convert the acculturated was just not as successful, or is it just a harder nut to crack?
So we saw a lift. We haven't gone back another time. The company was acquired, and so all of this is like now paused for this year. But that would be something we would definitely be looking at is based on what happened on those SKUs, who was driving those purchases in those SKUs. And I think that obviously is going to be a real proof of the pudding. But we feel like we did get that acculturated lady to at least maybe expand with an additional product, like the breadcrumbs, or she wasn't as much of a marinade user. But because we saw the lifts in the marinade and it was part of the AAU, and we already knew that the bicultural that was a heavy spice user was very marinade focused, and then to see that lift, it tells us that worked, and then it matches the creative that was running in English. So we are kind of able to connect some of those dots, though maybe not empirically, right? So,
Karla, this is really interesting stuff. Thank you so much for bringing it to us.
thank you.